Shouldn't they be back by now? He peeked over the trench, ensuring that nothing more than what was necessary was visible to the enemy. The fog was thick. He could see no more than 100 feet in front of him. The landscape he could see was utterly devastated. Enormous craters filled with toxic water, an inhospitable wasteland. His question gained no response. "Sir," he asked again, "it's been well over an hour." He looked over to his commanding officer, Sebastian Yarick, anxiously awaiting a response. The man simply stood there, staring up into the sky. After taking a long draw from his cigar, all he said was, "Can you not see them?" "No, sir, the fog's too thick." "Why don't you go up and look for them then?" He was slightly taken aback by this. "Sir, you must believe I'm a lunatic if you think I'm going to go up and go out there." Yarick, not changing his gaze from the grey sky, responded with yet another question. "Well, Private Davies, are you a lunatic?" Out of everyone he knew, Morgan Davies was the most sane person in the whole British Army. He was not a frontline soldier. He played the bugle while his comrades rushed over the trenches into battle. Morgan was in no rush to die in battle, so he's not trained in combat nearly as much as any of the others. He was okay with that. As much as he wanted to lash out at Yarick about how absurd his proposal was, he collected his bearings and replied with a very simple, "No, sir." "Well," said Yarick, snuffing out a cigar, "we will have to wait. They will either radio us when they capture the enemy position, or..." He paused. "We wait for the Americans to arrive." "Okay," said Morgan. "Let's wait it out then." Yarick nodded and turned around. He walked off, humming a tune that Morgan had heard but did not know the name of. It went something like, whatever. Morgan stepped down from his watch. Who was he kidding? It had only been an hour or so. Who was to say that the battle was over? He relaxed a bit. He was now faced with a predicament he had never encountered before. What now? Every other officer was missing in the fog besides Yarick, and he had walked off. Usually someone was telling him to do something, or to go somewhere, or to clean something up. But they were gone. Not dead. Sure. Surely out of 816 men in a Mark IV heavy tank, some would survive. They were good soldiers and he knew. They had been deployed. They had deployed there with them November 2nd of 1917, and they had become friends with most of them, practical brothers with some. They had celebrated Christmas and the dawn of the new year with him. They were good men. Morgan knew that God would see them through the fight. He walked over to the barracks where he and several hundred others slept, and it had never been so quiet. This was war, of course, so it was not the first time that men had been away in battle. However, this was the first time that they had not sent everyone. The Americans were supposed to be here by now. They were supposed to bring food and water, fresh supplies and ammunition. They were supposed to be men, not yet worn down by the horror of war. They had yet to arrive. Leaving Davies and Yarick alone in a practical fortress dug into the earth. With nothing left to do, Morgan walked over to his bunk and lied down. It was only around 10 in the morning or so, but with nothing required of him, his mind retired to a state of apathy. He had worked so hard every day for so many months, and doing nothing felt unnatural. He lay there in silence, eyes open, staring straight into the bunk above him. After some time, Morgan shifted his gaze around the room. He looked at the empty beds. The longer he looked, the more uncomfortable he became. It was as if he was looking at dozens of framed portraits whose subjects had got up and walked away. It was wrong. It was haunting. He returned his gaze to the bunk above him. Let me just get some sleep, and they'll be back in the morning, Morgan thought to himself. He closed his eyes despite feeling as if he was trespassing and sleeping in a haunted mansion. He was awoken by a gunshot in the late hours of the night. Morgan instantly jumped to his feet and grabbed his rifle that had not been shot since basic training so many months ago. The sound came from inside the trench. They were here, the enemy. He began to despair. There were men here to kill him, and they had already gotten Yarick. He was shaking, sweating so bad he could hardly hold his gun. A British standard issue short magazine, Lee Enfield, in his British uniform, in his British helmet, with his British fear of death, in French dirt, about to be killed by a German bullet. But why? Well, because he had to, because the Empire needed him. They needed him to sing young men off to their deaths. And now it was his turn to bleed out in the mud, completely and utterly alone. And there would be nobody to sing for him. He stood there in silence. The darkness enveloped him. After a seeming eternity, he worked up the courage to step out the door. If he were to die here, he would not die a coward. He walked at a snail's pace through the halls. There was a fire, a light emanating from one of the rooms, 80 feet from him. He walked towards it. Morgan Davies began to cry silently, creeping towards his no doubt inevitable death. 60 feet. What had he done with his life? Would it all be worth it? Who would benefit from his death? 40 feet away. The Empire, France, Germany, 30 feet. Certainly not his mom, his friends, or his family, 20 feet. Who would benefit? The men that were lost in the fog, 10 feet. Would they know of his sacrifice? 5 feet. No. It hit him. They would not, for he knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that they were dead. He rounded the corner and pulled the trigger on the first person he saw and nearly took Commander Sebastian Yarick's head off. The man did not flinch. "Davies, what the hell is wrong with you?" said Yarick. Me? Me? What the hell's wrong with me? Why on God's green earth are you shooting your gun in the middle of the bloody night? Morgan was fuming. "I almost killed you." It was then that Morgan noticed the rat that Sebastian had shot on a spit, roasting on a fire in the center of the room. "But you didn't, did you?" replied Yarick. "Am I dead?" "No, but maybe you should be." With that, Yarick stared back at the fire and began humming the song he was humming earlier, seemingly unbothered by the fact that he was an inch away from becoming a corpse only moments ago, or that he was about to eat a rat for dinner, or that he had the entire battalion that he had sole control over and responsibility over had been missing since that morning. "It's a long way to Tipperary." Shut up, Morgan thought. He was completely speechless. He stood there in shock for a minute or so, unaware of what to do. He turned around to leave. "Oh, Davies," said Yarick, "we are officially out of food. Get some rat, or go hungry." Morgan chose the latter and continued walking out of the room. He lay back down on his bed, the barracks still devoid of life. He never much liked Yarick, but found himself beginning to hate him. He was foreign to the concept of death. There was no sympathy in his body. And now, more than likely, Morgan's only friends were dead, only to satisfy Yarick's orders. He did not know what to think. They were alone. If the enemy wanted it to, they could come in and kill them both with no issue. Even if the enemy never came, the two of them would starve there to death. He would have wasted his life. He did not die in battle for his country, but alone, a coward, because that was what was required of him. A life wasted, and it was all Yarick's fault. He went to sleep, still terrified and praying that at least a few of his comrades would be there when he woke up. They were not. The morning air was cold. On autopilot, Morgan got up for morning roll call. The fog was just as present as the day before, and there was Yarick, standing, waiting in the courtyard for his battalion to show up. He seemed slightly perturbed that Morgan was the only one who appeared. After a brief moment of silence, Yarick spoke. "Where is everyone?" "Out there, sir." Morgan pointed past the old officer into no man's land behind him. "If they were great men, they'd be back here." Morgan was livid. "They are quite brave, sir, but the problem is that they are dead." His blood began to boil. "Where are the reinforcements?" "Certainly dead, too." "What was it all for?" "Who is alive?" Morgan pulled his handgun from its holster. "I'm not quite sure anymore, sir." He pointed it at Yarick, that disgusting old creature, a man without empathy. A man without empathy, a man without remorse. "Are you mad, Davies? What's gotten into you?" All of his friends and millions of others had died at the hands of scum like him, and now he was going to kill the tyrant Sebastian Yarick, and then himself. Because if he was going to die, it may goddamn well be for a reason. "You are going to get executed for treason, you know." Morgan said nothing in response. He cocked the hammer on his revolver. The metal was cold in his grip. He knew very well that he would get executed for this, but in this case, treason was a two-way street. Do you think I'm a bad guy, Morgan?" said Yarick. "Do you think I like sending young men to die? Well, it certainly seemed that way. This is war, Morgan. As brutal as it is, the men that we are fighting want to kill you and everyone they love, that you love. They already have. Look around you, Yarick. Everyone I know is gone, and you don't even care. Those men are never coming back. And just what are you going to do about that? Commit murder-suicide? Sorry. Commit murder-suicide? Just as Morgan was about to pull the trigger, he paused. He loosened his grip on the gun just a bit. He tightened it again as he remembered, they would all still be alive if not for you. You are wrong, Brother David. If I had never sent them, they would kick me out and have another man tell them to go out instead. He sighed. I've lived long enough, Morgan, so you can kill me, if that is what you really want. But let me first say this. The old man took a long, slow breath. Being in the army as long as I have, you live to see indescribable horrors every day that you wake up. I, like yourself, have had many close friends die for whatever excuse the king gives us. Morgan eased his finger off the trigger. They died for honor, for the empire, for their wives and children, Yara continued. Whatever the reason, they are 6 feet under or in 1,000 pieces strewn across the battlefield. Terrible things happen to people who don't deserve it, Morgan. It is at that point that the living decide what to do because of the dead. Do you despair? Let it consume you? Let circumstances that you had no hand in destroy your mind, body, and soul? Let me tell you, son, that's not a road you want to go down. Imagine your fallen comrades watching you from beyond the grave. What would they do? What would they want you to do? What kind of leader will I be if I let it all get to me? It's okay to be sad, Morgan. It's okay to cry over the loss of a friend or a loved one, but you must keep going so that you can carry their legacy with you wherever you go, so that they do not die in vain. Take your best shot, Morgan. Avenge the men I've killed. With that, he began to softly hum the song he'd been humming over the past day. What have I done? Said Morgan out loud. He tossed his gun to the ground. I'm sorry, sir. I really don't know what got into me. Put his head in his hands. What happens now? Well, started Yara, we are out of food, our men are missing, and our reinforcements are nowhere to be seen. The old man turned around to peer over the trench into the muddy wasteland behind him. Why do you say we go looking for them? We have no official report of their deaths. So they can take the enemy position and been too busy partying to send a message of their success. Morgan knew that proposition was lunacy. They both knew that the men were most certainly gone forever. He knew that it meant almost certain death. But so did staying where they were. Would he die a hero or a coward? Yes, sir, was all he could make out through his trembling lips. That's a boy. Grab your bugle, and the two of us shall march to victory. He retrieved his horn, watched as Yarick began to climb the ladder into no man's land. Morgan had never been over the top before. He had heard horror stories, but that was all he knew of the hellscape he was about to tread. Get up here, Private, that's an order. Morgan began his ascent of the ladder. The fog was still present, but not as thick. The battlefield before him was an ungodly mess of barbed wire, shell craters, dead bodies, and rot. After throwing up in his mouth, all Morgan could say was, Jesus Christ. Come on, soldier, let's move. Yarick began to walk into the wasteland. The trench that we are to capture is just a kilometer ahead. Let's make them proud and get there. Morgan followed him. The mud was so deep in parts that it enveloped his calves. Play us a song, boy. Do you know Tipperary? I've heard it enough times to try it, sir. Yarick began to whistle the tune. The one he had been humming for days now. How did he not remember it? It was there. He heard it. The sounds of tanks rolling through the hills behind him. The sounds of 1,000 men marching. They had made it, the Americans, and not a moment too soon. Morgan had done nothing but played hymns of war and sent his brothers out to die, cowering in the safety of the trench, fearful of what might happen if he did. He had been a coward his whole life. But now look at him. He was leading a charge to avenge his fallen friends. He hoped he could see them. He hoped he could hear them play. He hoped that he would know if he did. He had been a coward, but this changed this instant. The American reinforcements sang along. Hey, to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary. They scream to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly. Farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there. Is this what it was all for? Is this glory? The Americans started their own too. The enemy fired back. That confirmed it. The men that he had once known were dead. Morgan would kill every one of those bastards if it would do his fallen comrades proud. He was not following. He was taking action. The gunfire was deafening, but so was the realization that if he did die, his life would not have been wasted. He did not know where or what Tipperary was, but he was going to march to hell to get there if need be. He marched, Yarick pulled out his sword and pulled it pointed it ahead. He shouted to Morgan, "I'm proud of you, son. However this ends, I want you to know that we did a good thing today. The Empire owes you one." Marching to his death took every fiber of his being, so giving a response was out of the question. He nodded, and Sebastian Yarick understood. Despite this being the longest kilometer he had ever walked and a searing pain in his gut, he slowly began to feel that there were others marching with him, just besides Yarick and the Americans. He turned to London without a strange feeling that he should not. He kept his eyes on the prize, relishing in the glory and wondering how he even made it this far. Dump your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile. While you listen for the light, your bad smile, boys, that's the style. What's the use of worrying? It never was worthwhile. So pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile. At the end of it all, when the dust cleared, the American forces captured the enemy trench. Months later, the Great War came to an end. 18 million lie dead in its wake. And up until the last veteran the battle died, all who were present swore on their lives that they saw, ahead of them in the fog, over 800 silhouettes of British soldiers fighting and singing along with them, despite there being not one to celebrate with them when the battle was over. It's a long-ass way to Tipperary, ladies and gentlemen. When are you going to get up and go?